Hey everybody, welcome back. So today I have the pleasure of being joined by Avinash Chandarana from MCI Group. I have known Avinash for a couple of years now, right? Something like that. And mainly, we've been sort of interacting with each other as learning leaders in the space of global or group or corporate change. So transformation. And the big ticket with transformation at the moment is, of course, AI. And we've been discussing this kind of thing at various networking groups and various meetings over the last couple of years. But the reason I phrase it like that is that, in contrast to some of the last sessions that we've been running, where we've had suppliers who were talking about how they're working in the market and the innovations that they're bringing. This session's slightly different because in this session, when I phrased it like corporate or group or something like that, what I'm talking about there is enterprise. So we have big businesses that have leaders that try and push the boundaries, try and move things forward within their business, within their stakeholder groups for their clients and for their customers. And that usually requires a slightly different mindset than, for example, a supplier who's going to market and trying to innovate and trying to sell things. The considerations are different, the stakeholders are different, the needs are different. So it's a very different style of conversation that I'm expecting to have today. But before we go into that, Avinash, welcome.
Good to be with you, Ashwin.
Would you like to kick off by saying a few words about yourself? What do you do, and how in contrast to the things that I've just described, the suppliers might want to talk about, as somebody who's in house, as somebody who's leading things within a business, give us some of that context as to what your day-to-day kind of decision making around transformation looks like.
Sure. So I think just for context, indeed, I am actually responsible for learning and development at a group level, at a global level for MCI Group. And we're in the industry of what we call the marketing and engagement world. And at the heart of what we do for both the nonprofit sector, but as well as the corporate sector, is events, meetings, and congresses. But we have a lot of different verticals in our business, from public affairs, communications, different audiovisual, production, whatever it might be. We have a lot of different angles to our business. And again, as I said, across all sectors and on a global scale. So the internal demographic of our employees that we call talents is extremely diverse. Now, with that said, when we link it to learning and development, and my role and my team's role is to ensure that, of course, we are providing the required, let's say, programs, content, resources, support to help them develop the right capabilities, the knowledge and the skills and the attributes ultimately to perform at their best. So that is the context of what I do with my team. And of course, that requires, as you can imagine, with a global scope of 60 offices, 30 countries, multiple stakeholders, multiple verticals in the business, that requires partnerships, that requires an awareness of why we do what we do with learning and development. So I think from that perspective, Ashwin, looking at, my role, my team's role in the organization, of course, that will be quite different, I would imagine, of course, from the conversations you've been having with the vendors.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting to sort of start with that point in terms of the conversation, because usually what I've found in not only businesses that I've worked in where I've been part of leadership, or I've been like yourself, learning leader, but also as a consultant working with clients, this point about building awareness in the business and making sure that everybody in the business is aware of what learning departments do. This point is sometimes quite difficult because everybody in every business has their own agenda. They have the things that they want to do. Maybe you have an R&D department that they're focused on R&D. They're not focused necessarily on learning. So how do you build that awareness in stakeholder groups, sometimes the more difficult ones, where they're not that interested, or maybe they're too busy, they're time poor, and they have other things on their mind? How do you reach out to these people and touch hearts and minds to bring the message of learning and skills home?
That's a great question when we think about that awareness and that perspective of what we do. Everyone, by the way, in organizations believe in terms of their department or their responsibilities as a business unit or a function, they believe it's the most important. And that's no different for learning and development, right? We believe that what we're doing is the most valuable to the business. But when you really get down to the reality and step into the shoes of other stakeholders, other business leaders in the business, they still see, and still to this day, oftentimes, as learning and development being that support or back office function. I really don't like the term back office, but it's often used for learning and development, human resources, finance, etc. So I think we're already starting off at a point which is a challenge, is that perspective of other key stakeholders that are more frontline towards the clients, let's say, frontline to the business, how they see us and their perspective of what we do. Stepping back to where we are today in the organization, I'd just like to sort of give again a bit of context and history. I think that challenge I looked at head on right from the beginning when I started what we call the MCI Institute back in 2008. I'd been in the business already back in 1998, so I've been in the company almost 28 years now. Quite staggering when I think about those years in one organization. But starting off with, for example, in the area of talent development and management in one local office, I was able to see the potential that we had as a group that was growing globally. But I realized also that challenge of, okay, how do we establish the value of what we're doing when it comes to developing our people? I think the first step was branding. You hear about, of course, internal corporate universities and larger organizations. And I was inspired actually way back by the Disney Institute. And I thought, well, that's a great positioning. And I looked into that and I was inspired by that and said, okay, why don't we just create the MCI Institute? So that was a no-brainer. So why not? But more than just the name, it was more about intent. It was more about actually creating this umbrella brand that people can have an affinity to as we grew, that we could use to create value. Because it wasn't just about, oh, let's just do more courses and get bums in seats, which was the initial KPIs that I was given way back in 2008. But just get more people to courses. It wasn't about that. Of course, that's what we have to deliver. But what's the meaning behind it? What are we bringing to the table here? And that's the awareness building part, is that can we create a brand? And we all know the power of brands. We have affinity to brands, obviously as consumers. So I think that thinking back then was also shifting from, everyone's talking about the word training back in 2008. But I was aware that actually that really sort of put us in a box, and that didn't allow us to expand our opportunities to our talent. And that's where that learning sort of word sort of popped into place, that it was learning and development, not training and development. For those of you watching and listening, you'll remember those days when it was training and development. I think that was the first phase, right? Is evolving it to be more expansive. And that was under an umbrella brand. And I think building that brand started to show that people recognize the value of the investment we were putting into our talent development, because they always referred to it as the MCI Institute. This is the MCI Institute offering. No matter if it was about onboarding, if it was about leadership development, no matter if it was about academies, everything was under a brand. And that brought gravitas to learning in some ways, right? It wasn't just seen as, oh, just courses or webinars. It was seen under an umbrella. I think that was the first step, Ashwin, right? And there's more to it than that, of course, but the brand, I think, certainly has helped to create that awareness and that identity and that intent.
So these are very interesting points, and I'll give a little bit of a story. So what you said about support functions and back office functions, I've worked across a few of them. Back in the day, maybe 15 years ago or something like that, I was working in a kind of safety, security, business continuity kind of function. So all of these kinds of things together. There was a guy there I was working for. He was a great guy, still a great guy. He's still out there somewhere, but he has retired now. But he had this idea of branding, similar to what you're talking about. And he was talking about business continuity, but he was talking about it with research scientists, each of whom had their own programs. And he had this brainwave at one point, and he said, you know what? I don't go in and talk about business continuity. I go in and talk about the continuity of your research programs, research continuity, right? That one switch just landed the message, because he was talking about the thing that mattered to the stakeholders. And that was my first induction into the world of branding at that point. So fond memories. Mike, if you're watching, still respect that, right? So a little call out. But the other part of this is, when we think about this idea of kind of back office and value chain and all of these kinds of things, and the concept of training and learning. So we have, if you think about the value chain of a business, people and skills are part of that value chain. But the department that develops the people and skills, or helps to develop that, is supporting that value chain. And one of the things that I sometimes term as almost like a toxic relationship is that on the one hand, we have all of the training stuff we have to do, the compliance stuff. You will do this, you will do that, you will tick the box, you will go sit through this training course, you will go and click through this 30 minutes of e-learning. And then the next day we wake up and we say, you know what, everybody, we're here to develop you. We're here to talk about learning. We're here to talk about self-actualization. reach for the stars, be the best that you can be. And then the day after that, we go back and say, you will obey, you will do this thing. It's a delicate balance, right? And sometimes I think they should be two separate departments, because otherwise we're kind of good cop, bad cop to everybody, on a daily basis. How do you balance these things that you've mentioned, this movement from training through to development?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that's always an ongoing discussion. What is the role that we play, right? And exactly what are we providing that's meaningful and that's relevant. And that's the thing. It's not about more courses or more content and more resources. It's is it relevant in the context of the employee and what they do every single day? And therefore, how do we provide that, especially in the context of the increasing stress, anxiety, challenges that our employees face every single day with what they have to do? Because in the end, let's face it, they are delivering for the business. They are, okay, there's obviously people in the back office side working that you're also supporting, but the frontline workers, which is the majority of our staff, they're the ones that are working client facing, and they have a lot of pressure. And in our industry, certainly there are multiple deadlines, multiple events, meetings, conferences, not just one at a time. And that is intense. So I think that whole concept of, which we've heard about, of course, with the moment of need, how can we provide that? And I think there's a shift personally, I think, from the traditional form of courses, which I think has a place, depending on how we're delivering those courses and when, to the performance support element of the role of what learning and development is doing. That just in time opportunity for those that need something right now because they're faced with a challenge and they need content. So is it a course? No, not necessarily. Is it a tool? Yes. Can they find it quickly? Is it a bite-sized piece of information that will help them deal with that challenge they're facing right now? And I think that balance between, things like compliance and onboarding courses, which people have to go through just also as part of the culture, but also the need of the business. Yes. But then what is learning and development doing and shifting in terms of those, let's say, the new way of engaging, if you will, or the current form of engaging with the employees at the moment of need? And that's where technology, of course, plays a key role, because it allows us, especially when you're a group and you're a global business, it's so critical to be able to scale. So critical. And therefore, how is the technology helping us? And beyond that, let's go back to relevance and meaning. How can a small team, because we're only 4 full-time on a global level, how can we make sure that relevance is happening at local level, but also within the verticals of our business? We can't achieve that with the size of team that we are. So that whole concept of how can technology help us to, and I'm sorry to say this, I know it's a cliche, but I'm trying to think of another way of putting it, is that democratization of learning, right? Which we have experienced now for at least the past year and a half with the latest technology we're using, is we're empowering and creating that autonomy in local teams, local offices, business units to take control over their actual learning and development needs. And that has proved to be of significant value. And I just had that conversation literally just a moment ago with someone in a different business unit and said, you know what? It's been fantastic. And I was really surprised because they're saying, I needed to really push out some content for some new talent. And actually, we use the technology, the latest, learning system we put in place, the learning and knowledge platform. And because how easy it was to use, and it creates such an amazing experience, they were excited. Can you imagine somebody saying they were excited actually to create content themselves as a subject matter expert? And they did it. And they said it was so powerful. We used the AI functionality and they loved it. And actually, that feedback in itself has been, I think, really motivational for us as a team to say, wow, this is exactly what we wanted to do, is to get people excited, engaged, energized, which really we hadn't had before in the last few years.
Yeah. A few points I want to pick up on there. So first of all, this small team that you have. So one of the talking points around the AI revolution is that learning teams, you don't need that many people in a learning team to be able to reach the masses because we have scalable technology. And when you say you got a team of 4, do you think that's enough? Would you wish for more? Do you need more? Do you think you have too many? In terms of sizing, come across all types of organizations. Where's the Goldilocks moment? Is it too hot? Is it too cold? Where is just right?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. Is it, I believe right now, if I look at where we were, let's say a couple of years ago, and the team was the same size, I said myself plus 3 others. And by the way, one of them is in South America and 2 are in Spain, and not even based out of an MCI Group office. So, it is a true global virtual team. if I look at where we were 2-3 years ago compared to where we are today, and this is now as a result of the impact of implementing the latest AI first learning and knowledge management systems, we have seen, I think, that scalability go to another level, and the ability for us to play a slightly different role. Again, this is the evolution of what learning teams should be doing in terms of their knowledge and skill sets as us as a team, is that first and foremost, developing our knowledge and skills in the power and capabilities of generative AI and the tools that are available. That's the first step. We need to be aware and we need to develop our skills so that we can then be in that role of being a support team, that we can continue to train others who are subject matter experts, local HR, local leaders into how can you use the technology to make it more valuable for yourselves and your teams. So we're being more of a catalyst now. Are we also curating and creating content? Yes, we do. But I've seen a fundamental shift in terms of the output that we are actually putting into the business. And therefore, today, I think the number we have is a comfortable number. Coming back to do we need more or not, it's not about do we need more staff. It's about what the needs of the business are, always starting with that. Are we able to deliver to the expectations with the team that we have? And I think that's the questions that we have to be asking. Where is that gap? Or is there a new role that we don't have in the team that we can't just upskill someone in the team, but we need that new role because the business requires it? Then, okay, we can look at the equation of do we need to expand our team more? At this phase, I have to say, I think we're in a good place.
Yeah, and the technology enablement certainly helps small teams to scale. The other point I wanted to reference from what you said earlier was you've shifted from primarily making content or curating content towards an enabling function. You're enabling the business to go content first. And the example that you gave, the SME had great feedback because they were able to make content themselves easily. Now, this is a message that I've seen across various businesses, that we interact with SMEs. The SMEs come to learning departments and they ask for learning interventions, whether it's content or courses or whatever. And the job of the learning department is to service those SMEs, to service their needs, to keep those stakeholders happy. And if you can put tools in their hands such that they can do things themselves, then that's another mechanism to keep them happy. But what was the feedback of the learners? Because usually when you have large or established learning departments that make content, you will have roles like graphic designers, media designers, instructional designers, people who are professionals in doing that thing. And the output that comes from a professional designer usually is way different to the output that comes from somebody who's never really seen the tool before, but you pushing a couple of buttons. They find it easy, great, they're happy, but what they produce, it's not always amazing. So what did the learners say about this?
Right. I agree. I think that ability when you have expertise like in instructional design is going to create that different output that you refer to. Whereas, an SME, that's not their expertise, is it? I mean, they have that expertise in a particular area of topics or content, but they're not necessarily going to create that, engaging learning experience that leads to the results that we look for. And I agree. And I think part of it is the first phase is, of course, get them engaged in the first place to use, for example, technology to help them create and distribute content where we don't have the capacity because, as we talked about, the small team. That is a first phase. Now, does that mean to say what they're producing is at the highest level? Probably not. But it is the first phase, I think, of course, of sort of shifting from headquarters level team-based content creation to that sort of creating autonomy. Now, our role, therefore, has also having to shift, is to spend that much more time with the SMEs to, instead of creating content for them, is to say, right, go ahead and create the draft, and we're going to give you some tips of how you can improve it from a, let's say, educational point of view. Now, can we do that at scale? I think that's what we're still looking into. But I think once again, our focus has shifted in terms of where is that support taking place with SMEs compared to before. It was like, okay, tap into them and then we'll try to tap into their knowledge and then we would take on the heavy workload, right, of creating the content and the courses. Now we've kind of said, okay, you can take on some of the heavy workload and we will then support you on that journey by creating, giving you some ingredients or tips of how you can make it more effective. So it's slightly shifted. Coming back to the point of that example I gave earlier, that conversation I just had with SME, the reaction of the learner, because I did ask about that, was extremely positive. There was no doubt that they said, well, this was great. This was different. It was better than just sitting through 60 minutes because they did a much shorter form course, let's say. with some AI avatars included. So the way it was done and the way it was described certainly seemed, at least in this moment, to be effective, and the feedback was very positive.
So, yeah, let me just ask a little bit more about that. So, typically, because you mentioned avatars, I've been writing a paper on avatars for a while. It's a bit late, but anyway, I'm still doing it. Doing a little bit of research in that space. Now, when you present learners with something that is new, something that is novel, something that they haven't seen before, the feedback's usually going to be good. If you, for example, I'm not saying that you have done this, but I'm getting the feeling that maybe you have, is you put a license for Synthesia, Colossi, and HeyGen, some kind of avatar tool, in the hands of an SME, enabled them to make that content, potentially using templates and things like that. Learners are going to find that different if you weren't doing it before. That's subtly different to their learning, or you getting a better learning outcome, or they would be positively surprised by the fact that it came from an SME. Now, as an ex-scientist, I'm looking at this as an experiment, right? Are you comparing one thing to another? That's not always the case in corporates anyway. But with all of that being said, what you presented was there's phase one is making change happen at the point of the SME, finding out if learners are satisfied with that stuff. But you said phase one. So the obvious question is, what's the end game? Where do you want to go with this? Because one of the things that I have said in a handful of webinars and a couple of conference speeches is that we are rapidly getting to a point where the technology that's available to us, the AI, nebulous AI, whatever you want to mean by that, is capable of producing drafts, producing designs, producing storyboards, rapidly producing visually stunning content. If that's the case, then what is the role for some of the people who might be watching this who are in that instructional design, graphic design space? If I'm saying these kinds of things, that AI could be doing what you do, and the kind of thing that you're saying is we want to democratize and put tools in the hands of SMEs so they can reach their learners more quickly. We have a group of people who previously were making content, and the end game for those folks is, to me, it's probably a reskilling or redeployment exercise. But what do you think? What's your transformational goal? What's your end game?
Yeah, and that's a tough one. I mean, as do we all have the answers? I don't think so. That it would be great to have a crystal ball, but I think, as I said earlier, the role that we play as learning and development. As I said, being a small team, we're more generalists. I don't have an expert instructional designer. I have someone who's very good. Who's good with the technology and the platform, and they've got that role, right, to be that support. Is their background instructional design? No, but we are playing a generalist role, and I think that in itself has a strength because we're able to say that how do we adapt ourselves and where are we going as a team with the support we're providing to the business. And I think coming back to the whole phase of now, performance support seems to be a much greater, I'm finding that, I'm not saying that's for everyone, but rather than just the courses, is like performance support, how our people are learning is shifting as well. I believe in the power of how search is going to change the game. AI powered search within learning and knowledge systems we've got to shift that mindset. So what skills do we need to have that need to evolve, that is moving from the traditional way of what we were doing to what is going to be required for the coming years? Again, we don't know necessarily what's going to happen in 2, 3, 4 years. Who predicted where we would have been today 2 or 3 years ago? Very few people, to be honest. And I think I feel the same way right now when it comes to learning and development. What I do know is what value are we bringing? Always ask you that question. What value are we bringing? What is the business saying about what we're doing as output? And by the way, this is not just about the technology. So let's go back to that. We've just now launched a management development program, a revised version of something we used to do years ago. But now with the latest technology as a support and an enablement for management development, using AI simulations, for example. So I think the awareness of how AI is augmenting, I'm sorry, again, using words that are more cliches, but yes, indeed, augmenting the development journeys of employees. How can AI support that process? All of that has to be the skills that we need to have. And then putting those building blocks in place with the relevant initiatives like leadership development programs or upskilling programs, for example. So I know I haven't answered your question clearly at all because I don't have the answer. But the bottom line is we, as any, I think, employee nowadays in the world we live in, have to continuously evolve our skills to be able to bring that value. And then you have to define what the heck that value is, right, to the business.
Yeah.
Does it mean to say that some roles in learning and development might be having to change more than others, like instructional designers? The answer, I think, is yes, absolutely. I think Instructional designers need to find a way of saying, what is our purpose? They're going to be brilliant designers, but while more and more people bring that technology into their own hands to create content, maybe how do instructional designers, like I mentioned earlier, support that process? What is their new role they have to play compared to what they used to do 1 or 2 or 3 years ago?
Yeah, times do change. But if we pivot back to, because I agree with what you're saying, and one of the talking points probably of the last year, I would say, is this thing around performance consulting. Working with the business and making sure that all of that stuff is adding value, that whatever we do adds value. And I don't think this is just an L&D point. I think this is pretty much every department and every business is trying to demonstrate value more than they used to. And that means that inevitably we need to have different skills, we need to have different conversations, we need to be measuring different things. And for me, data is a big one. When we talk about performance support, performance consulting, how does that change for you, the things, because you mentioned earlier on, you mentioned maybe 30 minutes ago, looking at the clock, you mentioned KPIs that had been given to you when you were a training department, and now hopefully you pivot that conversation, you're developing your own KPIs. What kinds of things are you measuring when you move into the performance support arena, that are different to the traditional L&D sort of courses, click-throughs and things like that? How are you changing what you measure?
Yeah, and I think that's an ongoing journey. There's no doubt if we talk about trying to shift from what we would call inputs, I guess, right, and course completions. I mean, that's always an indicator. And we're seeing, of course, an uptick in terms of our inputs, right? In terms of the fact of introducing the new technologies, new resources, with AI first sort of enablement. We're seeing certainly, I think, in that first form of engagement levels to increase to a much higher level by 40, 50, 60%, which is phenomenal, right? In terms of from the content that we have, the resource engagement. I think that's a fantastic part. I think the hardest part for any learning and development professional in any organization, and we know, is measurement of impacts to the business specifically. And we are starting now. I mean, we try to do it, but it's so difficult and challenging to follow that journey from, the layers of Kirkpatrick or Phillips or whichever model you use of ROI and impact. It's so hard to do that, right? So I'm not saying anything that's unusual to anyone that's listening that's tried to measure ROI on learning interventions. We are looking at, for example, the management development program that I just mentioned earlier. We are looking at, okay, so when 1 year out, 2 years out, looking at, let's say, retention numbers, looking at promotions in terms of, okay, how many of those people, sort of A/B testing, how many people went through this program versus how many people, of course, have grown in the business, for example. What impact has there been on performance in their particular business unit? So these are the things that we're putting into place already. And when it comes to areas of account management and sales, using, of course, AI simulations, which we're about to put into place today as we move forward, what has been the impact once again on, increasing sales based on the learning that they've gone through versus those that haven't gone through that process. So again, this is work in progress. I mean, it really is a tough challenge. And I'm not going to deny or hide that, Ashwin, at all. We still do the basics, of course, completions and engagement levels and so on. But I'm fully aware, okay, can we underscore that with real hardcore KPIs? Very, very challenging to do, but we're on that journey.
Yeah, it's for me, this comes up time and time again, right? And I've done this multiple times with clients. For me, this is multivariate modeling. There are two parts to this. One is you need to have a data model, and the other part is that you need to be measuring the right things. And you plug the data into your model, and then you get outputs. It's fairly classical stuff. Why? I don't mean this as a pointy why, but why do you think learning and development departments struggle with this concept of ROI and data modeling so much?
I think there could be a number of reasons. One of them that I've identified, which I think is replicated in most L&D organizations in an organization, is the process takes a lot of energy and time and resources. The easiest thing you can ever do, of course, is to get the initial data and dashboarding of engagement, for example, or course completions. Fine. Okay, you get that. Quiz results, whatever it might be, test results. That's the easy part, especially nowadays with the technology getting better and better to capture that data. And that's often the sort of time that the report is used, as satisfaction surveys, you put it out there, it's done. Trying to follow that up, okay, coming back to what's happening in terms of the company culture, the type of business you're in, the type of work that people are doing, you would need to follow up over a period of time in order to measure that impact. of that
Mhm.
learning, because there are different layers, as we know, right, in terms of the pyramid or whatever it might be you're using on behavior change or performance impact, sales increase, whatever, retention numbers, etc. That takes a lot of time. And already the individuals or the stakeholders have moved on. You've delivered what you've delivered. You've got the initial results, and maybe they're satisfied with that, but they're not necessarily asking for something else after. The L&D department certainly is looking for it, but guess what? The amount of work that we have to do to continue the process of what we do still continues. I think being able to balance that time and the resource required to follow that full journey to get to those end results and that end impact, it's very challenging. And people just say, just move on, right? We're focusing on the next big thing that we have to work on. We don't have the time, we don't have the resources. Is that an excuse? It might be, but I do feel that that's been the reality that what we've been facing for quite a number of years.
While you've been talking, I've had a realization, right? And that realization is because you've mentioned Kirkpatrick a couple of times and you've talked about measuring behavior change. Now, measuring behavior change is classically difficult in nearly all of the psychology literature and information systems literature, or any of the literature that is founded on the theory of reasoned action or the theory of planned behavior or anything like that, which are by design kind of multivariate models anyway. Any of the literature that's founded on those things nearly always has a low-ish adjusted R squared when it comes to the model. So how much of the variance of, intention to do something can you explain with the factors that you're measuring? And it's not great. Behavioral science, generally speaking, would be, 40 to 50% explanation of variance would be a good thing. That would be an amazing statistic. If you look at hard sciences, that would be thrown out of the water, right? And the realization that I was having while you were talking is the nature of Kirkpatrick itself. So this is a model that pretty much everybody in the L&D business knows, and the ones that don't know it rapidly, as soon as they attend a conference or read anything about learning, they'll find it out, right? And I suspect the realization that I've just had while you're talking is that I suspect that because L&D folks are able to measure things like satisfaction and engagement, which are fluff anyway, and they're able to measure attendance, which again is vanity, it doesn't matter, and they're not able to easily measure behavior, they then don't go on to measure the things that matter to the business because they stop at this point in the middle. And I was thinking about every example that I've got of where I've worked with a client to model this stuff out. We've never looked at behavior. It doesn't matter, right? It actually doesn't matter if you have something around learning interventions and you have the results of the behavior, i.e. what people do at work, which you can measure. Why are you trying to measure behavior? And this might just be the stumbling block that everybody's saying, I don't know how to measure behavior, so I'm not going to bother with the other stuff. And I think there's another barrier there, and that is usually, I get this complaint a lot, but L&D departments will say, I asked the operations guys for their data, but they didn't want to give it to me. Nobody wanted to share it. I don't know how to get around that. What assumptions do I make? So I think there are these two things that probably are causing this industry-wide barrier that for me just seems not a barrier. And I think you've given me that realization.
I think this, Ashwin, yeah, you're absolutely right. But I think there's other elements as well. And every organization will be different, maybe in terms of how their leadership perceives learning and development and the value that it brings.
Mm-hmm.
And what are they asking for in terms of ROI? I remember attending an LPI conference not long ago. Can't remember who was speaking. And they said, there were about 100, and that's where we were there as well. Ashwin, you were there. And the question was asked to the audience. There were about 100 of us there. How many of you actually asked for ROI data from your CEO or the C level? And I think about 10% of the room put their hand up. And I think that was an interesting indicator. Asked, right? Doesn't mean say we don't believe it's important. We do. I think we struggle with it. We say we want to prove it. Maybe we're always fighting for the wrong thing, right? In terms of, are we putting our energy into something that is challenging, and there's a reason why it's challenging? Where are we putting our energy? Are we being asked that? And to be fair, if I ask that question to myself, who is asking me for ROI data? The answer is no one at the moment. Doesn't mean to say that we should, take our eye off the ball about the value that we provide. Otherwise, why do we exist? Otherwise, we shouldn't have a job. That's why I always focus on what is that value? And that value could mean so many different things. It's not just about the behavior change, but the applicability. Certainly, yes. Okay, are you applying at least at that level of what you're learning that's made a difference, whatever that difference might mean, right? To an individual. And has that helped you? It's almost that level of sort of discussion that we tend to have. and what then people are saying about the value they perceive they're getting out of the programs, resources, being a part of something, right? Which is about our culture. The fact that, wow, this is an organization that believes and invests in learning, and I'm proud of that. If people are saying that, and that's what I'm really excited about, that I'm excited about attending the business academy that we had in Copenhagen as an opportunity. The fact that we take those learnings and actually then have continuity because we localize it with managing directors. They find value in those actions that learning and development has created. And then they continue to leverage that content that we've created, and they will apply it at local level. And we keep a track of that. Now, that in itself, that to me is value. And if the managing directors also are talking about that value and how their employees are feeling excited about, for example, these programs that they're attending, that seems to be extremely powerful for our business. I'm not saying that's okay for other businesses, but for us, that seems to be a massive driving force. And when our CEO talks about it and says, you know what we're doing from a learning and development point of view as our strategy is extremely powerful, and we really are pushing the boundaries and leading the way. Well, I think that's what we're looking to hear, and I think it's fantastic that we get that kind of feedback from such a level of the company.
I'm going to ask a pointy question now, right? Everything you've just described, I'll be devil's advocate for a second. Everything you've just described is CEO satisfaction, is manager satisfaction, is regional satisfaction, is stakeholder satisfaction. It's just satisfaction, right?
True.
It's not value in terms of value chain. It's nothing to do with value, right? People can be very unhappy and still be productive. People can be very unhappy and still learn a lot. In fact, I would go as far as to say people learn the most and remember the most for situations that they were uncomfortable and unhappy in.
Absolutely.
So, right, we've measured lots of satisfaction. Everybody's happy, everybody's satisfied, everybody's shaking each other's hands. Great. What's the relation of that to business value?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I mean, but again, I think when we think about where we are today with, and that use an example, with generative AI and the ability to bring, as a learning and development department, beyond satisfaction, bringing relevant, meaningful content, which develops the knowledge and capabilities of our global talent base. In this case, it's a directive from the CEO saying, we are, as part of our vision, going to put AI first, right, in terms of part of our business strategy. We, of course, align to that and say, right, this is what we're going to provide, right, continuously over the coming year and beyond, step by step in phases to have, for example, a readiness framework in place. And indeed, engage everyone in the company. And that is something we work with, for example, with the CIO in hand, and ultimately to try and upskill our people. Now, that has been a continuous journey so far, starting over a year ago. And that is something that continues in terms of providing the capabilities through learning and development to do a more effective job. So this is not just about satisfaction. It is that skilling part. It is about how can you be more productive? How can you use AI in such a way that's going to help you to be more creative? So all of the different functions as well as the business. That is something that's concrete. Now, do we say that's value? Then it's a question of what's your definition of value, Ashwin, right? And what's mine? Now, is that just satisfaction? Yeah, they may be satisfied the fact that we're providing them with the relevant training, but is it bringing value to the point that, hey, it's helping me be better using this new technology that I didn't know before, and now I have the knowledge and skills to be better at what I do? So the answer is that's what we're trying to do.
The thing I'm trying to tease out is that there is a difference between your CEO says implement an AI literacy course and you do it and everybody's happy versus you have because we were talking about measurement. Ultimately, we were talking about measurement. And there's a difference between that you measure satisfaction, everybody is happy and you log that, versus you have a way to relate what you do to the value chain of a business. So the things that matter to the business are usually our share price, revenue, sales volume, these kinds of things. And the reason I talk in that respect is because when we talk about performance consulting, we're also talking about the performance of the business, not the performance of the learning department. So if we have programs we've been told to implement and people are happy that we implemented them, then we are order takers. And fine, people are always going to be happy having order takers around to do their bidding. That's not the same as relating learning performance to business performance as part of the value chain. So that's why I'm trying to tease that out to see if.
So don't you think learning performance? I have a question for you then. So don't you think learning performance has a link to business performance? And I'm not talking.
It should do.
So in other words, the end result of if we consider learning itself and what we're providing, in terms of the programs, resources, initiatives. And that we target as, okay, this is to help you improve your performance in whatever area that is, right? That you need to upskill in or grow, whatever. I call that learning, the performance part of the learning and development department, right? So we're actually boosting or driving performance of the individual or teams. So to me, if that is a direct connection to the performance, it should show a direct performance to the business in various areas, depending on whatever you're providing as the need and support. So what's your take on that? I'm curious.
So the question I'm asking is, I'll break this down. You've got the performance of the learning department. So the learning department has various amounts of budget, various amounts of people, and they have a task to go and do. Are they performing that task? That's the performance of the learning department. Your workforce also has tasks to go and do. You pay them salaries, and they have job descriptions, or they have things that they have to go and do, activities and tasks. And you can measure the performance of those things. The business itself also has performance. As a value chain, it has inputs, throughputs, and outputs. And the outputs are something to do with money usually. Now, the thing I'm trying to tease out is it's fine to measure the performance of the learning department. Pretty much every learning department in the world does that. It's also good, very good, to measure the performance of the workforce. And the thing I'm asking you about is, you able to, or is it might be something that's on your to-do list or something on your roadmap, but relating the performance of the learning department and potentially the individuals to business performance. This is ROI. This is when we talk about ROI,
Sure,
we talk about performance consulting. That's the thing we're talking about.
Absolutely
so
right.
In that space, and this is the thing that you said was difficult, that I was saying, I don't find it to be that difficult, but where are you on that journey of relating the things you do in learning to the things that matter to the business?
Right. And I think, again, coming back down to performance, what is that, right? And talk about value, right? To me, value can mean multiple things. I break it down into, for example, saving time, making money, reducing expenses, right? For example, productivity, reputation is value as well, right? Reputation.
Yep.
Which is a little bit harder to measure, right? So those are components of value that we need to understand first and foremost in order to then sort of map, are we influencing, impacting those areas? So I did say that earlier, is that we're on that journey as an example. If it's about, building our consultative capabilities, right, as an organization, putting in training, resources, programs, whatever it looks like, right? We did it at our academy. We're continuing it on at local level learning days, etc. Being more consultative, as an example, for the account managers and sales. Now, that's a very direct approach if we think about what we're providing, to say, okay, we need to then measure those that have gone through that experience, whatever that might be, as an initiative, to then say, how did that influence the growth of an account? How did that influence, for example, new client acquisition? So I think that is something that's hardcore business driven, no doubt. And indeed, I did refer to that earlier, saying using, for example, simulations using AI, right, for the sales force is something they're building out. And that is something that I'm very eager, coming to your point, to measure what has been the result of that in their work. So I think that's very direct and hardcore, coming to your point. Now, I don't know if that's exactly what you mean, but that's the way I see it.
That's exactly what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's harder, though. You see, when you think about other jobs, though, it's typical, though, Ashwin, right? Account management, sales, these are typically areas that, people are looking at, oh, does it increase sales? Does it increase revenue? Did you grow the account? But other functions in the company, it's harder, right, to have the measurables in the same way. But that's maybe about more productivity. Are you more productive? Because we do look at that as a KPI, productivity, right? Productivity ratios. So that's an area that we can target, being more efficient, implementing new ideas, being more innovative, being more entrepreneurial because of the initiatives and programs that we provide from learning and development. A little bit harder to measure, as we talked about earlier, as to why as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And everything you've said, absolutely great example is sales. Everything else is slightly harder, but you can still look at the tasks and activities that you mentioned, right? So if on a very, very cursory level, but if we were to say that it takes somebody, 20 minutes to write up the minutes of a meeting, and now AI is able to do that for you at the click of a button, and somebody looks at it and it takes 5 minutes. Great, you've saved 15 minutes every meeting. So there are things like that which you can start to measure when it comes to knowledge work, of course. So absolutely that's where I would start if I was going to do this for you. If I was going to do that for you, I would be starting at the activity level. So to say, well, these are the tasks that aggregate into activities. Each one has a resource burden. How do we then aggregate that into something that's quantifiable.
And that
So
started
it's
already. You're
reasonably done.
absolutely right. We started that efficiency level. Coming back to my point, although I didn't articulate it well enough, the fact of our learning department being the size it is today, we have increased our efficiency because of, for example, the integration of the latest technologies. That has helped us to be more efficient. And again, it's not just saying putting out more content out there because we're more efficient, but it allows us to then spend more time in maybe other areas to focus more on that strategic side, that performance consulting side. So again, the efficiency that's being brought in with technology and with AI is definitely helping us, starting with us as a team. So you imagine, multiply that out in terms of what's happening in the business. With that is definitely happening, right? And some of that is also related to the programs and initiatives that we're putting out there. But you're absolutely right. We're missing an opportunity to measure that and quantify it and report it. And I think that's something that we'll very much look at as a result of this conversation.
When it comes to measurement, everybody that I speak with in the learning sector hesitates. It's a difficult thing. How do we do it? Where do we start? And what I've just said about measuring meeting minutes, it was a little cursory, but it's start somewhere. Start with what you know, and then build out your model accordingly. So I'd like to just pick on the point of AI for a second, and that is that we've talked about AI a couple of times in our past, and we've mentioned it a couple of times on this podcast as well. And there are. So I have a readiness model. I can't remember if I sent it to you, but I will after this if I didn't. Readiness is a thing that we all need to kind of make sure that we have the things in place, the foundations to allow us to implement something successfully. From your perspective, the things that you've been implementing and the directions you've been taking in your business, have there been either any significant barriers? Because we've talked about opportunities a little bit around things like content and platforming. Have there been any significant barriers from your perspective where something was insurmountable? You had to go and do something differently because there was some reason why you couldn't implement the thing that you wanted to implement.
Related specifically to AI, you mean?
Yeah, AI.
I'm happy to say not really barriers, right? That was insurmountable because I started off the journey very early in 2017, looking at AI and working with a company out of London. And that really set the foundations of being, inquisitive. And the leadership was aware of that. They didn't pay much attention to it at the time. And that wasn't generative AI. So it was a different game, but it was AI and personalization and so on. Going back then, Netflix of learning stuff was always talked about with context. And I think that opened the door to when I sort of looked into the latest technologies, this is about a year and a half ago, soon after generative AI came out and 2 years ago, I knew that we had to shift. And we were very quick on the mark from an L&D point of view, saying, this is what we need to implement. This is why. And I think that immediacy of already the leadership knowing that we'd work with AI, that they knew that we're always pushing boundaries from an L&D point of view. There was a trust there. They were open to listening and ultimately working closely with the CIO. That was critical. Who are the key stakeholders? The CIO, the data protection officer, and so on. Right from the get-go made a huge difference. So rather than challenges, it's a matter of what did it take to make sure those challenges didn't exist or those obstacles weren't there. It was actually doing that, right? Just in terms of making sure the right people were involved at the right time. They were aware of what we were doing and why we were doing it. And that made all the difference. And by the way, from actually going through a process of literally only 2 months of looking at the solution providers, signing a contract, and 3 months later, it actually rolled out the platform, having had a 9-year legacy system in place. Within 3 months, we had rolled out a platform globally in person at an academy with 300 leaders. So all of that was all due to everything I just mentioned about partnerships internally and stakeholders.
Yeah. Well, that's a speedy one. And that's victory is where we will end today. Everything that Avinash has been saying, I'll put his LinkedIn in the comments below. Everything that he's been saying it gives a very rounded picture of, you need to have that credibility with your stakeholders. Everybody needs to be on board with what you're doing. You need to be reaching the parts of the organization that you need to with the interventions and the things that you change and measuring appropriately. So that's a very rounded view of what good looks like if you're in an enterprise, corporate, or a group function and you're leading, you're enabling your business. So thank you very much, Avinash, for today's conversation. If you are watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. If you're watching this on Spotify, don't forget to follow the channel. Until next time.